Jon Stewart is out there, the comedian, used to be a comedian. I don't really know what he is right now. But he's out there very upset, calling out Ted Cruz and a bunch of other people. And we're going to play a couple videos because it's been very confusing what they did here. What they essentially did is there's this discretionary budget and this mandatory budget. They took $400 billion out of the discretionary budget, put it over to the mandatory budget, and Republicans are out there saying that that means they're going to spend $400 billion on a bunch of stuff that is not even going to be related to veterans' health care. Then people are looking at the bill, and they're saying, no, look at the bill. It says they got to spend this money on veterans' health care. The other side that Jon Stewart's mad about is that Republicans passed this thing in middle June, the same bill. Nothing changed in it. What did change was the Inflation Reduction Act, which popped up last week magically with about $400 billion worth of spending on climate-related things in it. So that's one thing that popped up that they're saying.
It's going to reduce inflation.
That's going to reduce inflation. Yeah, of course. Why would you even question that?
This is all conceding the fact that we have $400 billion to spend.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the $400 billion, by the way, it's already in the budget. This bill itself adds $280 billion for this specific burn pit thing. But what they did was they took another $400 billion and they shifted it from discretionary to mandatory. We're going to watch some videos that are going to get us learned up on this whole topic. We'll see who's right. We're going to play a couple from Jon Stewart and one from Pat Toomey, who's the one who said that they should not vote in favor of it.
I'm used to the lies. I'm used to the hypocrisy. I'm used to all of it. But I am not used to the cruelty. They passed it. June 16th, they passed the PACT Act. They passed it. Every one of these individuals that has been fighting for years, standing on the shoulders of Vietnam veterans who have been fighting for years, standing on the shoulders of Persian Gulf War veterans fighting for years, Desert Storm veterans, to just get the health care and benefits that they earned from their service. They lived up to their oath. And yesterday, they spit on it.
How do you deny that? I mean,
that gets you fired up.
I'm mad.
That gets the people going.
I'm mad at the Republicans. Let's vote them out. Vote every one of them out of office.
How could they be so cruel?
Terrible people, of course. But there is more to this story. Now, Jon Stewart has another video, and I've kind of slimmed some of this down to the meat of the issue, and then we'll get to Pat Toomey's actual speech about what was wrong with this bill so we can see who's right about this whole thing.
As the Democrats played a budgetary trick, which is they took $400 billion in discretionary spending and they shifted it to mandatory.
One thing, what Ted Cruz is describing is inaccurate, not true. This is no trick. Everything in the government is either mandatory or discretionary spending, depending on which bucket they feel like putting it in. The whole place is basically a fucking shell game. And he's pretending that this is some new thing that the Democrats pulled out, stuck into the bill, and snuck it past one Ted Cruz. It's always been mandatory spending so that the government can't just cut off their funding at any point. No trick, no gimmick, been there the whole fucking time. It's nonsense. There is nothing in the bill that is not related to.
Okay, now where he just said it's always been mandatory spending, just so you know, what he means is in this bill, which was passed in June, it was mandatory spending in that bill. He is right. It did not change. This actual spending, obviously, it is in the bill. It changes it from discretionary to mandatory. So the $400 billion has not always been mandatory spending. It's always been discretionary spending.
It's only always been as of this bill.
As of this bill that they voted on June 16th, It has been in mandatory.
Every time you say that, I cringe because you're like, gee, I feel like you're saying Jan 6.
Oh, man. I'm sorry.
I cringe until you get June out all the way.
No, I would never bring that up.
Okay.
We'll have to edit that out.
Thanks.
Veteran spending. And don't take my word for it. An app on an iPhone. Read it. It's at congress.gov. This is for veterans who suffered health effects from being exposed to burn pits and other toxins. That is it.
What the Republicans got made clear is if we leave that spending as discretionary, don't play the budgetary trick, the bill will pass with 80 or 90 votes.
I don't know how many other ways to say this, but there was no budgetary trick and it was always mandatory. And when they voted in the Senate on June 16th, they actually got 84 votes. And you know who voted for that? Ted fucking Cruz and every other one of those Republicans that switched their votes. There was no reason for them to switch the votes.
All right.
He feels a way about this.
It is the same bill. He's right about that. Now, he was wrong about something very specific that he said in there. He said, look at the bill, go read it. It says mandatory, this is what it must be spent on. Okay, he's kind of right about that. But there is a budgetary gimmick that they are playing. Now, he's wrong and he's right. He's wrong about this doesn't create any more money for being spent. He's wrong about that. He's right about the fact that this bill didn't change from the one on June 16. He's right that the Republicans voted to pass this bill on June 16th. They did. And they changed their votes. And maybe it has something to do with this Inflation Reduction Act and all the spending that's inside of that. Maybe none of them read the bill and they've had time to read it since then. I don't know. So he is right on that fact. But I did also want to play. There is a very important lesson to be learned in this entire thing. This is why we're talking about it. We don't normally talk about all these little political infighting things on specific bills going back and forth. There is a reason that this all really matters that we will get to. Here's what Pat Toomey had to say about it.
Now, to explain this a little bit, Mr. President, I've got to explain a little bit about how the federal government spends money around here. We have two big categories of federal spending. We have what we call discretionary spending. That is the spending that is appropriated annually by Congress. That spending is limited every year. There's a cap on how much can be spent in that category. That's the first category. The second category of federal spending we call mandatory spending, automatic spending. It occurs not by appropriation, it's driven by eligibility for various programs, and it does not depend on a congressional appropriation. So those are the two big categories of spending. Now, of course, as we all know, current law already obligates the VA to spend a great deal of money on veterans' health care and benefits, as it should. In particular, there's about $400 billion over the next 10 years that the VA will spend on veterans' toxic exposure care and benefits, about $400 billion. That's existing law. That's going to happen no matter what we do with this bill. That $400 billion has always been categorized in the discretionary spending category. Now, what the PACT Act does is it expands this obligation on the part of the VA, and it expands it a lot by about $280 billion over the next 10 years. And it takes all of that new spending, the $280 billion of new spending that the VA will spend under the PACT Act, and it puts it in the mandatory spending category. I have no quarrels with the $280 billion being in the mandatory category. Here's the budgetary gimmick. This is what is outrageous. The bill takes the $400 billion that I mentioned earlier that is obligated to be spent by the Veterans Administration by legislation passed many years ago, money that's going to be spent. It enables that spending to be shifted from the discretionary category to the mandatory category of spending. You could say, well, so what? The government's still going to spend the money either way. That's true. It's going to go for the same purpose to the same people who need it. That's all true. So why does it matter? Well, here's the reason. By moving this big category of spending, this $400 billion, out of the discretionary category and putting it into mandatory, you create this big hole under the cap. Now, when you create that big hole, guess what happens with that big hole? It gets filled with spending on who knows what. Now, again, I want to stress, my quarrel here is not with the underlying purpose of the bill. It's about a budget gimmick that's designed to allow hundreds of billions of dollars in additional unrelated spending, having nothing to do with veterans. Could be anything. It's this big, gaping hole created by design in our discretionary spending category.
How many people do you think are actually going to go listen to that?
I got to tell you, Jon Stewart's much more articulate.
Yeah. Jon Stewart's argument was much more compelling. Republicans hate veterans. Let's just say that.
Yeah.
That's way easier.
Yeah.
Republicans hate veterans. That's all it is. So here's what they did. They took that money out of the discretionary budget and they moved it into the mandatory, but the money they've already appropriated into discretionary, now they've just made a bunch of room in there.
It wasn't a one-to-one transfer.
No, it didn't remove the money from the discretionary and put it in the mandatory. It keeps the budget in the discretionary, and it makes new money in the mandatory. And so they just created another $400 billion that, like he just said, it's going to get spent on something. And it doesn't have to be veterans, likely won't be veterans.
And then some.
And then, yeah, both of the sides here are right. There is a budget gimmick that has occurred here where they've created $400 billion in the budget to spend on things that are unrelated to veterans health care. That is extremely true. It is true that this was in the bill that they voted on in June, and they were fine with it. The Republicans were fine with sneaking through with that. That's what everyone needs to learn. There's what happens when you don't actually have any principles. Sometimes you get caught not having any principles, and that's what just happened to them. The $400 billion they're talking about still going to get spent regardless. It's already in the budget. They're just talking about how they can add in this new $280 billion. It's not that they don't have any budget for people exposed to toxic burn pits. But of course, Republicans hate veterans. That's the main thing that you want to get across. The Democrats are geniuses when it comes to, it's just like the Republicans voting to end Obamacare, you know, when they didn't actually have any power. The Democrats right now, they're doing all this stuff to try and make Republicans look as bad as possible. They can, like trying to legalize weed, but basically creating a way worse environment for legalized weed than there even is for like illegal weed right now. Or with contraceptives, they're going to have a vote on the contraceptive thing, you know, and it skips around the religious freedoms and is going to force businesses that don't want to provide it. But that means Republicans want to ban contraceptives. That's what that means. They had that vote, and so they're really geniuses when it comes to this. Here's the point. This, you know, you say like this is your brain on drugs. This is your health care on government. This is for veterans. This is for the people that we will get chills and cry and take off our hats for them and all the stuff that they've done. Imagine this being for all the health care expenditures for everyone in the United States all the time. Every year, all the time. What are they going to do? I do not trust the government to do this kind of BS controlling all the Medicare for all for everyone.